Sarah Martinez had always been different from other Marines, though she never talked about it. Walking through the crowded military base in Norfolk, Virginia, she kept her head down and moved with purpose. Her uniform looked exactly like everyone else's, standard Marine dress blues, with clean pressed lines and polished buttons. But there was something in the way she carried herself that made people look twice. The morning started like any other Tuesday. Sarah grabbed her coffee from the base cafeteria and headed toward the administrative building where she worked as a liaison officer. The job was mostly paperwork, coordinating between different military branches and handling communications that came through various channels. It wasn't glamorous work, but Sarah preferred it that way. She had grown tired of attention and preferred the quiet efficiency of behind-the-scenes operations. As she walked past a group of young Marines gathered near the flagpole, she heard the familiar sound of military banter. They were discussing weekend plans and complaining about their commanding officers in the way that soldiers always do. Sarah smiled to herself, remembering when she used to be part of similar conversations many years ago. "Hey, you there," called out one of the Marines, a young man who couldn't have been more than 22. His name tag read Johnson, and he had the cocky confidence that came with being fresh out of basic training. "What's your rank? You look a little old to be a private." Sarah stopped walking and turned around slowly. The group of Marines had formed a small circle around her, their expressions ranging from curious to mildly amused. She could see they meant no real harm. This was just typical military teasing that happened when boredom set in during long days on base. "I'm sorry?" Sarah asked, though she had heard the question clearly. "Your rank," Johnson repeated, pointing at her uniform. "I don't see any obvious insignia. Are you even supposed to be walking around here without proper identification?" The other Marines chuckled, thinking this was going to be an entertaining way to break up their morning routine. They assumed Sarah was either a new recruit who had forgotten to wear her rank insignia, or perhaps a civilian contractor who had mistakenly put on a military uniform. Either scenario would provide them with a good story to tell their friends later. Sarah looked down at her uniform and then back at the group. Her expression remained calm and neutral, showing no signs of anger or embarrassment. She had been in situations like this before, though not often on American soil. Most of the time, people either knew exactly who she was, or they had no idea at all. "I'm a Marine," she said simply. "Well, obviously," Johnson laughed. "But what kind of Marine? Lance Corporal? Sergeant? You've got to have some rank, right? Unless you're telling me you're an officer, which would be pretty funny considering you're walking around here all by yourself." The assumption in his voice was clear. Officers, especially high-ranking ones, didn't walk around military bases alone. They traveled with aides, assistants, or at least other officers of similar rank. The idea that this quiet woman in her 40s could be anyone important seemed ridiculous to the young Marines. Sarah considered her options. She could simply walk away and avoid the entire situation. She could show them her identification card and end their curiosity immediately. Or she could let the situation play out naturally and see what happened. After a moment of thought, she decided on the third option. "What do you think my rank is?" she asked, turning the question back on them. This delighted the group even more. Now they had a guessing game, and Marines loved competition of any kind. Johnson stepped forward, clearly appointed as the spokesperson for the group. "Well, you're definitely not enlisted," he said, looking her up and down. "You've got that officer look about you, but you're too old to be a lieutenant, and too young to be retiring anytime soon. I'm guessing captain, maybe major if you've been in for a really long time." "Captain sounds about right," agreed another Marine, a woman with corporal stripes on her sleeve. "You've got that serious look that captains get when they have to deal with paperwork all day." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, as if considering their assessment. The truth was, their guess wasn't entirely wrong about her having an officer bearing, but they were drastically underestimating just how far off their estimates were. "Those are reasonable guesses," she said. "What makes you think I'm not enlisted?" "The way you stand," Johnson explained, warming to his subject. "Enlisted personnel have a different posture, more rigid, more by the book. Officers learn to relax a little bit, especially when they're not in formal situations. Plus, you didn't immediately tell us to address you by rank, which means either you're not high enough rank to care, or you're confident enough in your position that you don't need to demand respect. It was actually a fairly insightful observation, and Sarah found herself impressed by the young Marine's analytical skills. He was reading body language and social cues in a way that showed real intelligence and attention to detail. "That's very observant," Sarah said. "You might have a future in military intelligence." "Thanks, ma'am," Johnson replied, pleased with the compliment. "So are we, right? Captain or Major?" Before Sarah could answer, a commotion started at the far end of the courtyard. A black sedan with official government plates was pulling up to the main administrative building, followed by two more identical vehicles. This wasn't unusual on a military base, but the sudden appearance of multiple official cars always drew attention. The group of Marines turned to watch as the vehicles parked in a perfect line. From the first car emerged a tall man in navy dress whites, his uniform decorated with enough ribbons and insignia to make it clear he was very high-ranking. Even from a distance, the Marines could see the stars on his shoulder boards. "That's an admiral," whispered the corporal. "What's an admiral doing here?" Two more officers emerged from the other vehicles, both also wearing Navy uniforms with admiral rank insignia. The sight of three admirals arriving together was extraordinary. Admirals were the kind of officers that most enlisted personnel might see once or twice in their entire careers, and usually only from a distance during formal ceremonies. The three admirals stood by their vehicles for a moment, apparently waiting for something or someone. They were scanning the courtyard, as if looking for a particular person. "I wonder what's going on," Johnson said. "Must be some kind of inspection or official visit. We should probably make ourselves scarce before someone decides we need to be part of whatever formal ceremony they're planning." But Sarah wasn't moving. She was watching the admirals with an expression that had changed from casual amusement to something more focused. The Marines noticed her shift in attention and followed her gaze. "Do you know what's happening?" asked the corporal. "I have an idea," Sarah said quietly. That's when one of the admirals spotted Sarah standing with the group of Marines. He immediately straightened up and said something to the other two officers, pointing in her direction. All three admirals began walking across the courtyard toward them. The group of Marines suddenly felt very nervous. Having three admirals walking directly toward you was not typically a good sign. It usually meant either you were in serious trouble, or you were about to become part of something much bigger and more important than your normal duties. "Uh-oh," Johnson muttered. "What do you think they want?" "I think they're coming to see me," Sarah said calmly. "You?" Johnson looked at her with surprise. Why would three admirals want to see a captain? Sarah didn't answer immediately. The admirals were getting closer, and she could see their expressions more clearly now. They weren't angry or stern, which might have been expected if this were some kind of disciplinary action. Instead, they looked respectful, almost deferential. "Because," Sarah said, finally turning to face Johnson directly, "I'm not a captain." The three admirals approached with measured steps, their polished shoes clicking in perfect synchronization against the concrete courtyard. As they drew nearer, the young Marines could make out more details of their impressive uniforms. Each man wore multiple rows of ribbons, indicating decades of distinguished service, combat deployments, and commendations that most military personnel could only dream of earning. Johnson felt his mouth go dry as he realized the gravity of the situation unfolding before him. Whatever was about to happen, it was clearly far beyond anything he had experienced in his brief military career. The other Marines in the group seemed to share his growing apprehension, shifting uncomfortably and exchanging nervous glances. Sarah, however, remained perfectly calm. She straightened her posture slightly and clasped her hands behind her back in a stance that was unmistakably military, yet somehow different from the rigid attention position that enlisted personnel were taught. It was the bearing of someone accustomed to command, someone who had learned long ago that true authority didn't need to be announced or displayed aggressively. The lead admiral, a distinguished man in his early 60s with gray hair and sharp blue eyes, reached the group first. Instead of addressing the young Marines who were standing at increasingly nervous attention, he focused entirely on Sarah. His expression was one of deep respect, mixed with what appeared to be genuine pleasure at seeing her. "General Martinez," he said, coming to a crisp halt and rendering a perfect salute. The word hit the group of Marines like a physical blow. General. Not captain, not major, not even colonel. General. Johnson felt his face flush hot with embarrassment and something approaching panic. He had been joking around with a general. He had questioned her rank, made casual conversation, and treated her like a peer. The other two admirals had reached them now and immediately followed their colleagues' example, rendering identical salutes with the precision that comes from decades of military protocol. The sight of three admirals saluting anyone was remarkable enough, but the fact that they were saluting the woman these Marines had been casually bantering with just moments before made the scene almost surreal. Sarah returned the salutes with equal precision, her movement crisp and economical. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying a tone of authority that had been completely absent during her conversation with the Marines. "I wasn't expecting to see you here today. We apologize for the unscheduled visit, General." The lead admiral replied, lowering his salute. "Admiral Richardson, by the way," he added, extending his hand to shake hers. "We've been corresponding through official channels, but this is our first face-to-face meeting." "Admiral Richardson," Sarah acknowledged, shaking his hand firmly. "Please, call me Sarah when we're not in formal setting. And these are Admirals Morrison and Chen, I presume?" The other two officers stepped forward to introduce themselves personally. The level of deference they showed was unmistakable. These were men who commanded aircraft carriers, led major naval operations, and held positions of enormous responsibility within the military hierarchy. Yet they were treating Sarah not just as an equal, but as someone whose expertise and opinion they clearly valued highly. Meanwhile, the group of Marines stood frozen in place, unsure whether they should flee, salute, or simply try to become invisible. Johnson, in particular, was experiencing what felt like an out-of-body experience as he replayed every word of his conversation with Sarah, searching for anything that might be construed as disrespectful or inappropriate when addressing a general officer. "We wanted to discuss the Joint Operations Planning Committee recommendations in person," Admiral Morrison explained to Sarah. "Your insights on the coordination protocols have been invaluable, and we're hoping to get your input on the implementation timeline." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "I've reviewed the preliminary reports. There are definitely some areas where we can improve inter-service communication, particularly in rapid deployment scenarios. But perhaps we should continue this conversation in a more appropriate setting?" She glanced meaningfully at the Marines who were still standing nearby, clearly overwhelmed by what they were witnessing. Admiral Chen followed her gaze and seemed to notice the young service members for the first time. "Of course," he said. "We don't want to interrupt your morning routine." Sarah turned back to the Marines, her expression softening slightly as she took in their shocked faces. Johnson looked particularly pale, and she could see that he was struggling to process what had just occurred. "Marines," she said, her voice returning to the gentler tone she had used during their earlier conversation. "I believe you had some questions about my rank?" Johnson managed to find his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than actual speech. "General. Ma'am. I'm sorry. We didn't know." "How could you have known?" Sarah interrupted, saving him from further embarrassment. "I wasn't wearing rank insignia, and I didn't introduce myself properly. Your questions were perfectly reasonable under the circumstances." She paused, studying the group of Marines who were now standing at rigid attention, clearly terrified that they had somehow committed a career-ending breach of military protocol. "Relax," she told them. "You're not in trouble. In fact, I enjoyed our conversation. It's rare that I get to interact with Marines without the formality that usually comes with rank. Your observations about Officer Baring were quite accurate." Marine Johnson. The use of his name surprised Johnson. He hadn't remembered telling her what it was, but then he realized she had probably read his name tag during their conversation. The fact that a general had bothered to remember the name of a low-ranking Marine she had met for 5 minutes spoke volumes about the kind of leader she was. "Thank you, ma'am," Johnson managed to say. "And again, I apologize for any disrespect." "There was no disrespect," Sarah said firmly. "You were professional throughout our entire interaction. Military courtesy doesn't require you to guess someone's rank when they're not properly displaying it." Admiral Richardson had been watching this exchange with obvious interest. "If you don't mind me asking, General, why aren't you wearing rank insignia?" Sarah smiled slightly. "Habit, I suppose. I've spent so much time in situations where displaying rank would be counterproductive that I sometimes forget to put it on when I'm in normal duty situations. Plus, I find that people interact more naturally when they're not intimidated by stars and eagles." "That's an interesting leadership philosophy," Admiral Morrison observed. "It has its advantages," Sarah agreed, "though it does occasionally lead to conversations like the one we just had." The corporal, who had been part of the original group, finally found the courage to speak up. "Ma'am, if it's not inappropriate to ask, what is your actual rank?" Sarah considered the question for a moment. "I'm a brigadier general," she said. "1 star. I know that might seem like a lot, but in the grand scheme of military hierarchy, I'm actually somewhere in the middle of the officer ranks." The Marines absorbed this information with visible amazement. A brigadier general was not somewhere in the middle of anything, from their perspective. It was a rank so far above their own that most of them had never even spoken to anyone who held it, let alone had a casual conversation about weekend plans and military bearing. "How long have you been in the Marines?" Johnson asked, his curiosity overcoming his nervousness. 23 years, Sarah replied. "I enlisted as a private when I was 18. Worked my way up through the enlisted ranks, and then received a commission as an officer about 15 years ago. It's been quite a journey." This revelation added another layer of surprise for the young Marines. Many general officers came from military academies or college commissioning programs. The fact that Sarah had started as an enlisted Marine, just like them, made her accomplishment even more remarkable. Admiral Chen checked his watch and cleared his throat gently. "General, I hate to interrupt, but we do have that meeting with the Joint Chiefs at 1400 hours. Sarah nodded. "Of course. Marines, it's been a pleasure talking with you. Keep asking good questions and stay curious about the people around you. You never know what you might learn." As the Admirals and Sarah began to walk toward the administrative building, Johnson called out, "General Martinez, ma'am." She turned back. "Yes, Marine Johnson? Thank you for not making us feel stupid." Sarah smiled, and for a moment, she looked exactly like the friendly woman they had been joking with 20 minutes earlier. "Marines are never stupid, Johnson. Sometimes inexperienced, occasionally overeager, but never stupid. Take care of yourselves." The group watched in stunned silence as Sarah walked away with the 3 admirals, their conversation shifting to topics involving strategic planning and international relations that the Marines could barely follow. As they disappeared into the building, the Marines finally allowed themselves to relax. "Did that really just happen?" the corporal asked. "We just spent 20 minutes talking to a general," Johnson said, shaking his head in disbelief. "A general who started as a private. And she was actually nice about it." "More than nice," another Marine added. "She could have destroyed us for questioning her rank, and instead she turned it into a teaching moment." As the adrenaline began to wear off, the Marines started to appreciate just how remarkable their encounter had been. They had not only met a general officer in an informal setting, but they had learned something about leadership, humility, and the importance of treating people with respect, regardless of their apparent status. Little did they know that their brief interaction with General Martinez was about to become one of the most talked-about stories on the base, and that Sarah's approach to leadership would soon be making waves far beyond the Norfolk military installation. Word of the encounter spread through the base faster than wildfire. By lunchtime, every Marine, sailor, and officer on the installation had heard some version of the story about the general who had been mistaken for a low-ranking Marine and had handled the situation with remarkable grace and humor. The details grew more elaborate with each telling, but the core message remained the same. Brigadier General Sarah Martinez was not like other high-ranking officers. In the base cafeteria, groups of service members huddled around tables, discussing what the incident revealed about leadership and military culture. Staff Sergeant Williams, a veteran with 15 years of service, shook his head as he listened to Johnson's first-hand account of the morning's events. "I've met a lot of generals in my time," Williams said, and I can tell you that most of them would not have been nearly so understanding about being questioned by junior Marines. The fact that she took time to actually talk with you guys, and then thanked the Admirals for waiting while she finished the conversation, says everything you need to know about what kind of leader she is. The story had reached the ears of Colonel Harrison, the base commander, within hours. His initial reaction was concern that his Marines had somehow committed a protocol violation that could reflect poorly on his command. But when he received a detailed report of the incident, his worry turned to pride. The Marines had conducted themselves professionally throughout the encounter, and General Martinez had specifically complimented their behavior in her brief conversation with him later that afternoon. General Martinez told me that your Marines demonstrated exactly the kind of initiative and critical thinking skills that the Corps values. Colonel Harrison informed his senior staff during their daily briefing. She was particularly impressed with Marine Johnson's analysis of officer bearing and military posture. She said it showed real observational intelligence. Oh, the ripple effects of the morning's encounter continued throughout the week. General Martinez, who had originally planned to complete her liaison duties quietly and return to her regular assignment, found herself staying an extra few days to participate in informal leadership discussions with junior officers and NCOs who had requested meetings. Her approach to these sessions was unconventional. Rather than delivering formal lectures about military leadership principles, she engaged in conversations about real-world challenges that Marines faced in their daily duties. She talked about her own experiences rising through the ranks, the mistakes she had made as a young Marine, and the lessons she had learned about the difference between commanding respect and earning it. The morning I met those Marines in the courtyard, she told a group of sergeants and corporals, I had a choice. I could have immediately identified myself and shut down their questions, or I could use the situation as an opportunity to learn something about how my Marines think and observe their environment. I chose the latter. And I'm glad I did. Lieutenant Patterson, a young officer who had been struggling with how to connect with the enlisted Marines under her command, raised her hand. General, how do you balance approachability with maintaining the authority necessary to lead effectively? Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. Authority that depends on rank insignia and formal protocols is fragile, she said. Real authority comes from competence, integrity, and genuine concern for the welfare of your people. When Marines trust that you know what you're doing and that you care about their success and safety, they'll follow you anywhere. But that trust has to be earned through consistent actions, not demanded through regulations. She paused, looking around the room at the faces of the junior leaders who were hanging on every word. The Marines who questioned my rank that morning weren't being disrespectful, she continued. They were being observant and curious. Those are exactly the qualities we want to encourage in our people. If we punish or discourage questions and independent thinking, we end up with Marines who follow orders blindly without understanding the purpose behind them. That's not what our Corps needs. Master Sergeant Torres, a grizzled veteran with multiple combat deployments, nodded in agreement. I've seen too many young officers try to lead through intimidation and rank structure alone, he said. It might work in the short term, but it doesn't build the kind of unit cohesion you need when things get difficult. Exactly, Sarah agreed. And it doesn't prepare our Marines to become leaders themselves. Leadership development isn't something that happens automatically when someone gets promoted. It has to be modeled and taught through daily interactions. The discussion continued for another hour, covering topics ranging from mentorship techniques to crisis decision-making. But the underlying theme remained consistent. Effective leadership required humility, emotional intelligence, and a willingness to connect with people as individuals rather than just as subordinates in a hierarchy. By the end of the week, the impact of General Martinez's visit had extended far beyond the original encounter with Johnson and his fellow Marines. Officers throughout the base were reconsidering their own leadership approaches, and enlisted personnel were talking about the importance of maintaining professional curiosity and initiative. Colonel Harrison requested a formal meeting with General Martinez before her departure to discuss the possibility of implementing some of her leadership philosophies into the base's professional development programs. What you've accomplished here in a few days is remarkable, he told her during their meeting. The level of engagement and discussion about leadership principles that I'm seeing from my Marines is unprecedented. They're not just talking about following orders anymore. They're talking about understanding the purpose behind decisions and preparing themselves to make better decisions when they become leaders. Sarah smiled. That's the goal, isn't it? We're not just training Marines to follow orders today. We're developing the leaders who will guide our Corps tomorrow. Every interaction we have with junior Marines is an opportunity to reinforce the values and thinking patterns that will serve them throughout their careers. Would you consider returning to conduct formal leadership seminars? Colonel Harrison asked. I think your approach could benefit not just this base, but Marine installations throughout the region. I appreciate the offer, Sarah replied. But I think the most important lesson from this week is that leadership development happens in everyday situations, not just in formal classroom settings. The real question is whether your officers and NCOs will continue to look for teachable moments in their daily interactions with their Marines. She stood up to leave, gathering her briefcase and cap from the colonel's desk. The Marines who questioned my rank that morning didn't need a formal leadership seminar, she continued. They needed someone to take their observations seriously and help them understand what they had noticed. That kind of mentorship can happen in any conversation, at any time, if we're paying attention to the opportunities. As General Martinez prepared to leave the base, she made one final stop. She found Johnson and the other Marines from that morning working on vehicle maintenance in the motor pool. They immediately came to attention when they saw her approaching, but she waved them back to their work. I wanted to thank you for the conversation we had earlier this week, she told them. It reminded me why I love being a Marine. Your questions and observations were excellent, and I hope you'll continue to approach your duties with that same level of curiosity and attention to detail. Johnson stepped forward. His confidence noticeably improved since their first meeting. General, ma'am, thank you for taking the time to talk with us. Both that morning and throughout this week, we've all learned more about leadership in the past few days than we had in months before. Leadership isn't something you learn once and then stop thinking about, Sarah replied. It's a continuous process of growth and adaptation. Keep questioning, keep observing, and keep looking for ways to better serve your fellow Marines. As she walked away from the motor pool, Sarah reflected on the unexpected turn her routine liaison assignment had taken. What had started as a simple case of mistaken identity had evolved into a week-long masterclass in practical leadership, but more importantly, it had reinforced her belief that the future of the Marine Corps depended on leaders who were willing to engage authentically with their people and create environments where questions and curiosity were welcomed, rather than discouraged. The story of the general who was mistaken for a junior Marine became part of base lore, told and retold to new arrivals, as an example of how true leadership should look. But for those who had been directly involved in the encounter, it represented something more significant. Proof that rank and authority were tools to be used in service of something larger, not ends in themselves. Years later, when Johnson had become a sergeant and was leading his own team of Marines, he would often think back to that morning in the courtyard. The lessons he learned about observation, respect, and authentic leadership continued to guide his own approach to military service. And whenever one of his Marines asked him about effective leadership, he would tell them about the day he met a general who taught him that the best leaders are often the ones who don't need to announce their importance to the world.